On 26 October 1888, a group of boys were playing football in a lane behind Cheyne Street in Stockbridge, Edinburgh, with a bundle they'd come across. However, it began to unravel, and inside was the mummified body of a 1-year-old baby boy. The police were called, and a post-mortem was carried out. It was concluded he'd been strangled with an apron string. Detectives James Clark and David Simpson were given the case and began door-to-door inquiries in Cheyne Street. They discovered that a couple, the McPhersons, had moved into lodgings belonging to James Banks, a plasterer, around 5 months earlier, and it had been noted the woman had once been seen with a baby boy around the age of the deceased child. When she was asked about the baby, she told the locals he'd been adopted. The police duly interviewed Mrs. McPherson, only to find out she wasn't Mrs. McPherson at all, but 27-year-old Jessie King, née Keane. She was living with Thomas Pearson, a Glaswegian some 30 years her senior, as man and wife, both of them under the assumed names. She worked as a sex worker and had a daughter, Grace, but the baby disappeared a few weeks after she moved in with Pearson. When asked by the police to search their rooms, Jessie became agitated and objected when they asked to see in the cellar where they kept their coal. It was only when threatened they would break the door down that she relented. To their horror, they found the body of a baby on a shelf, and she and Pearson were arrested. The little girl was judged to be around 2 months old, and she too had been strangled. News of their arrests was published in the press and came to the attention of Janet Anderson of Preston Pans. Her sister Elizabeth Campbell had died a week after giving birth to a son, Walter, in May 1887. The father, David Findlay, had promised to pay for the child's upkeep for 3 months, but when the funds ran out, advised Janet to have the child adopted. A Mrs. Stewart and the man with her, who she introduced as her father, had seen this advert in the paper, received £5 from him, and took the baby with a view to having him adopted. This happened when they lived in Dalkeith Road, and neighbours noticed the baby, then his disappearance a few weeks later. They were told he was being fostered out to an aunt. Findlay later identified Jessie and Pearson as a couple who'd taken his son. However, the baby found wrapped up wasn't him. He was later identified as Alexander Gunn. In early 1887, Catherine White gave birth to twin boys. They were illegitimate, and the father wanted nothing to do with them. She called them Alexander and Robert. They were born in the house belonging to a Mrs. Mitchell, a respectable lady, and she brought in a nurse, Euphemia Mackay, to help with the birth. Catherine was a domestic servant and couldn't look after them, so she placed them in the care of Margaret Henderson. She visited the boys regularly and had a good relationship with Henderson, who looked after them well. After a few months, she realised she couldn't cope and decided to put the boys up for adoption through Euphemia Mackay, who placed an advert in a local paper. The boys were separated, and one of them, Alexander, fell into the hands of Jessie for £3. At the beginning of August, Catherine decided to visit her sons, and when she arrived at Anne Court, where Jessie and Pearson stayed, she was told they'd moved on and had left no forwarding address. She contacted the police and later identified the little shoes on the remains of the Cheyne Street baby as Alexander's. She also identified Jessie as the woman who'd taken her son. This was also backed up by a former landlady, Mrs. Mackenzie, who'd heard her call the child by his name, and when questioned about his whereabouts, when she hadn't seen him for a while, they said he'd been adopted. Another woman to come forward was Alice Tomlinson, an unmarried mother who'd given birth to a little girl on 11th August, and whom she named Violet. Again, an advert was put in the paper looking for adoptive parents, as the young woman was in poor health, and the father didn't want anything to do with his child. A woman calling herself Mrs. Burns came and took the baby for £2, saying it would be easy to find adoptive parents as she was healthy. Mrs. Tomlinson attempted to visit baby Violet, but once more Jessie and Pearson had moved on. Violet's body was the remains found in the coal cellar at Cheyne Street. Isabella Banks, daughter of Jessie's landlord, gave testimony that she'd seen her with a baby girl in that September, playing happily with her, saying the baby's mother was picking her up soon. She was never seen again. Pearson, meanwhile, denied the charges. Jessie told the court he'd refused to accept the baby, and they couldn't get anyone to adopt him because he was illegitimate. The couple were also struggling for money, so she strangled him when Pearson was out. She said she had wrapped him in Pearson's waterproof to stop him from smelling, but had taken the body when they'd moved to Cheyne Street. She went on to say the baby girl had been crying, so had given her whiskey to quieten her down. She began coughing, so she choked her, then placed her on the shelf where she was found. Although she admitted to these crimes, Jessie never confessed to the murder of Walter. At her trial, which began on Monday 18th February 1889, she was charged with all 3 murders, but Walter's death was later withdrawn as there was a lack of evidence. Due to her confession and insistence that Pearson knew nothing, all the charges against him were dropped, as long as he agreed to appear for the Crown. Despite her confession, Jessie pleaded not guilty, but her solicitor, Fitzroy Bell, called no witnesses and relied on his address to the jury. He suggested the bodies of the children had decomposed so badly that it was impossible to tell if they'd been murdered. He also suggested Jessie was under Pearson's influence at the time of the killings, and even suggested the women who'd given up their children had some degree of responsibility for their deaths. He was hoping to get Jessie the lesser charge of culpable homicide, but the judge, Sir John MacDonald, Lord Kingsborough, in his summing up, could find no grounds for this, and if they believed she had killed one or more of the children, she should be found guilty of willful and premeditated murder. The jury took just a few minutes to find her guilty of premeditated murder. She began sobbing uncontrollably and had to be supported by prison staff as the death sentence was passed on her. While Jessie awaited the hangman's noose, she tried to take her own life several times in prison, and her mental health was assessed by Sir Douglas Maclagan and Sir Arthur Mitchell. They both found her sane. A petition with 2,000 signatures for clemency failed to make any difference. Just before her trial, Jessie gave birth to a baby boy, Thomas, who remained with her in prison until the night before her execution. He was taken by the Roman Catholic Church to be adopted. She confessed to her priest, and he wrote to the Secretary of State, stating she had made her initial statement in order to save Pearson, who she told him had had a hand in at least one of the deaths, and, in the other two, he stood near directing and guiding her in the administration of the whisky. He went on to suggest this hard-hearted man and unfaithful husband, as he'd been married and had left his wife and family, had directed the unsteady and clumsy hand of a poor woman he had made his slave. It was all to no avail. On Monday 11th March, Jessie was led to the scaffold. She wept with her female warders as she said her final goodbyes, and the hangman, James Berry, placed a cap over her head to prevent her from seeing the scaffold. Just before he pulled the lever, she admitted to him she'd killed all 3 of the children because she couldn't bear hearing them crying. She was the last woman to be hanged in the city. It's thought she was guilty of killing more children, but they have been largely ignored by the justice system and history. Her body was taken down and buried under the car park of St Andrew's House, which was formerly the site of Calton Jail. As for Pearson, he died the following year in Glasgow. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.